Hello. Um, I haven't done a video in quite a while, but there are things that need to be discussed. Those of you not aware, I am running a very late entry write-in campaign for the United States Senate from my home state of Arizona. My name is Daniel Pack. I am a furloughed retail worker who is trying to present at least one working class voice for 2020, and I will likely do so again for 2022. I don't expect that when 2022 comes along, when 2022 comes along, that these issues will be in any way, shape, or form truly addressed. Issues that need to be addressed. I don't see anything with either of the two major U.S. Senate candidates, Mark Kelly or Mark McSally, to lead me to believe that they will in any way be addressed. One of these is foreign policy. Our foreign policy is frankly crap. I'll be blunt here. Our foreign policy is one of reckless foreign interventions, regime change wars, inventorism, destabilizing countries, toppling legitimate elected governments, as well as dictators, of course, but toppling governments, destabilizing countries, creating chaos. Our government has become a chaos agent in the world. It has become an aggressor state, a rogue nation. And this needs to be addressed. There's been a lot of talk about Russian intervention in our elections, and to whatever extent that happened, I think it was more limited than people want to say. But to whatever extent it happened is wrong. But it's just as wrong for us to involve ourselves in other countries' elections, in other countries' internal affairs. The fact of the matter is, as you can see, I'm not a polished speaker, I'm not a professional politician, but I believe very strongly that what we need in this country is a new course, a new path, both in foreign policy and domestic policy, and those two are much more connected than people realize. If you continue to waste money on the bloated Pentagon budget, it was approaching $750 billion this last time around, then you're going to have a real problem with affording anything. As the Biden people even told somebody recently, the cupboard will be bare. And that's not an accident, that's design. If they bare the cupboard, that means that they don't have to do things for the working class. They can continue to focus, by using up all the resources on war, continue to focus on enriching the already rich, making them even wealthier, creating an even greater divide between the classes. You have a middle class that is shrinking and is all but gone now. There's practically no middle class in America anymore, except for maybe the upper middle class. They're about the only ones who manage to keep themselves together, and that's only because they have been hit by the many blows, especially by coronavirus and the lockdown effects. The shuttering of the economy has been devastating, absolutely devastating for the working class and the middle class in this country, whatever is left of the middle class, because there's not much. It's pretty much gone. With the constant assault on unions by big business, by right-to-work laws, with the, in fact, deunionization of our working class over the past decades, with the continued wars, the continued laissez-faire, free-market fairy nonsense, deregulation, triangulation, neoliberalism, austerity policies that only give table scraps to the poor like we're a bunch of dogs. It's ridiculous. The poor and the middle class in this country have been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. Prices continue to go up, and the wages stay stagnant. There goes your mad theory that you can control prices by controlling wages. You don't. Prices will continue to grow anyway. There's the dirty secret. You might as well raise the wages to try to keep up with them. If they had indexed the minimum wage to inflation this whole time, it would be much, much higher than it currently is. Certainly higher than $7.25, which hasn't been changed since the 2000s. We're talking about the Bush administration at the height of the Iraq War, which, by the way, isn't fully over yet, is it? So, there's that. There's the drug war. There's the gentrification of our cities. There is redlining policies by banks that target certain demographics for denial of loans, business loans, home loans, so forth. There is, frankly, a consistent policy of, bailouts, corporate bailouts. They spend all this money bailing out Wall Street constantly. We've seen the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which happened under a Democrat, I might add. It happened under Bill Clinton on his watch. He signed off on the repeal of Glass-Steagall. What did that mean? Well, the repeal of Glass-Steagall means that you cannot separate, or they cannot force you to separate, the risky investment banks from the deposit accounts. So you have the deposit account banks, the institutions being directly linked to and part of and connected to the high-risk investment banks, which have different functions. And so if something goes wrong in those, high-risk investment banks, as they did in 2008, there's no way to separate that effects from hitting the depositors, the depository institutions, credit unions, the personal checking accounts, and so forth. There's no protection other than the FDIC, and the FDIC has limits. It'll only protect up to a certain point, right? It has limited resources. So we've seen under the Clintons, we've seen under Bush, we've seen under Obama, we've seen under Trump a steady, continued policy of favoring the big banks, Wall Street, so forth. Did they learn nothing from the S&L scandal? Apparently not. Remember the savings and loan scandal that happened in the early 1990s. You would think that after the S&L scandal, after seeing the effects of this kind of thing on our economy, on our overall economic and financial health, that they would be wanting to increase regulation. You would think, especially with a Democratic president like Bill Clinton, the moment he got into office, his agenda would have included tightening the restrictions and regulations on Wall Street, and maybe even introducing a financial transaction tax. What that is that you have a tax on the highly volatile stock manipulation, speculation. So if you have people, cycling through stocks and day trading, engaging in high risk investment, selling and buying of shares and so forth, high risk, high yield stocks, have higher profits, yes, but have a higher risk of, might lose your shirt. And they're highly volatile. To reduce the volatility, to get more revenue, and to kind of cool things down in a reasonable way, as it were, keep things from getting overheated and turning into a bubble, it would be helpful to have a financial transaction tax of that sort. It has been suggested. It actually does exist in some countries. I believe it exists in France, if I remember correctly. And it would be another way to help to finance some badly needed expansion of our federal programs. Now, I used to be very much in favor of cutting federal programs. I used to be in favor of cutting agencies, cutting regulations, cutting taxes on the rich, cutting taxes on everyone, thinking that, of course, this laissez-faire policy was going to be great. The wealth would trickle down. I used to believe in myths like the Laffer curve and so forth. If you don't know what the Laffer curve is, it's one of the most damaging, harmful pieces of right-wing libertarian mythology, economic mythology out there. The belief that the more you have this necessary taxation on the rich, the more you're going to actually inadvertently cause a harmful effect on the economy and on investment and so forth. There's been no real evidence to this fact. I mean, one might very well point to the 1950s, in which the top marginal rate, bear in mind this is a marginal rate, it's not a rate on the total wealth of the person or the total income of the person. It's the marginal. It's above a certain amount. It's a certain set amount that is not taxed. And then you have beyond that an amount that can be taxed, a percentage of it. The top marginal rate in the 1950s was 91%. That sounds extreme, but remember, again, this is a marginal rate. A certain amount, there's a certain ceiling or floor, or whatever, separating what can be taxed and what cannot be taxed. So there's non-taxable income, and there's marginal taxable income, and a certain high percentage of that was taxed. Well, what happened? There was actually more investment because people could take that money instead of paying taxes on it. They could invest it into their companies. They could invest it into their workers. And so it still had the same benevolent effect. It just didn't go through the taxation because they knew that if they didn't invest that money, it was taxable. Money they didn't invest would be taxed. So that was a good way to encourage investment. But the biggest issue, the biggest problem, the real issue that's most urgent, that must be dealt with right away, is stimulus. We badly need stimulus 2.0, and we need to be on steroids. We need stimulus on steroids. We need absolute radical stimulus. We need stimulus like Clinton or Obama would never have dreamed of in the height of their popularity when they first came to office, when they both had favorable Congresses and so forth. They had the opportunity for real stimulus, and they blew it. They were cowardly. They were too cautious. Now, at the time, of course, I was of the other view. I was, again, right-wing orthodoxy, austerity, Austrian School of Economics. I was a libertarian of the right-wing version for a very long time. That was my ideology. I've since seen the bankruptcy of that ideology because I have seen in real life, in real terms, the gulf between the difference between what they say and what is the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is this: the economy is not, the wealth is not created by the rich. They don't, the billionaires, they don't create the wealth. They extract it. Who creates the wealth? The workers, the farmers, the consumers, people who are actually doing things with the wealth, doing things with their money, spending their money, saving it if they can, but most people can't afford to save anything. There's a reason why most people don't have $400 saved for an emergency. They can't afford to save anything. There's nothing left to save. So when you have a situation where there's nothing left to save, you're not going to get savings and nobody's going to be able to retire. So you're going to have these 72, 73-year-old men and women still working as Walmart greeters or whatever else that they can get. I guess they got rid of the greeters, but whatever job they can get the elderly to do, probably into their 80s at some point, until they just drop dead because they work themselves to the bone. Um, but you see this gulf between those who actually create the wealth, who don't get the fruits of their labors, or anywhere close to the fruits of their labor. If you doubt what I'm talking about, look up something called the labor theory of value. Now, it is a brainchild of Karl Marx, but Marx was not wrong about everything. I'm not a Marxist, but I see a lot of his critiques of having validity. The reason I'm not a Marxist is I don't believe there's any guaranteed path in the future. There's no certain historical certainty of what will happen, stages of capitalism or socialism or whatever. Nothing in this is set in stone or guaranteed. Marx believed that there was an economic determinism which would eventually be inevitable and imminent, and was inexorable. It would be unavoidable. I don't view it that way. I think history has shown that while Marx's critiques of capitalism are in many ways spot on, they are not accurate predictions to everything. I mean, for instance, he would not have foreseen Lenin. Marx would never have predicted a socialist revolution in Russia of any kind. Certainly not within 100 years of his lifetime. He would never have imagined it. It was a country of peasants, as far as he knew. It was not a country with a fully developed industrial proletariat. So it was Lenin that made that happen, and of course through a great deal of terroristic methods of brutality and atrocities that I would not even begin to try to excuse. I'm not a tanky by any means. But the fact of the matter is, what we have in this country, some people call it a bifurcated economy, some people call it a K-shaped recovery. It's been going on for quite a while. The 2008, 2009, 2010 recovery was a K-shaped recovery, sure. It really didn't reach out into the lower classes. It did not. I mean, if you were upper middle class, you did great under the Obama administration. You did great under the Bush administration, the Clinton administration. All these administrations, you did great. When was the last time that the working class really did great? It stopped sometime in the 70s, right? So you see an increasing, shrinking percentage of wealth held by the poorest, and a growing percentage of the wealth held by the richest. And even the upper middle class are, pushing aside anyone who might be a threat to them. So there's that, We have disinvested in our education system. Our public education system has been gutted. Programs have been slashed repeatedly, especially here in Arizona. And what has that gone to? Tax cuts for the rich, throwing in new businesses, but all that gets is low-paying jobs because people aren't properly educated, aren't skilled. Where's the money for the vocational training programs? Trade schools for people who are not college inclined. In Germany, they have apprenticeship programs. They have vocational training for many Germans who do not have the aptitude for scholarly pursuits, but are very good at practical, mechanical, electronic, technical work. Technicians and so forth, that are great at that kind of stuff, but don't really have the skills for the other kind of work. Different set of skills. There's nothing wrong with that set of skills. And they need to respect that. People don't respect that nearly enough, just like they don't respect real intellect. What's respected in this country is money. If you got money, you're respected. Wealth is respected. Everything else is set aside. There's that saying, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Well, there's plenty of people who are very intelligent people that don't have a nickel to their name. Because wealth and intelligence have very little to do with each other. Many of the people who have these opportunities in life might get a higher education just because they have the money to pursue the higher education. And that's where the problem comes in, of course. A large part of why our current intelligence is viewed in a negative way is because many people sense that they did not earn all of that. That a lot of it was handed to them. Now, that's not true for a lot of people. There are people who work their way up, who have risen through academia and so forth. But there's that sense because what happens? There's a connection between wealth and intelligence in this country in the sense that there's a feeling that, well, you got that in education because you were wealthy, could afford it, which is true in many ways. But it's not true, despite what people seem to think, that if you're intelligent, some people seem to think that it goes both ways, that if you're intelligent, it automatically breeds wealth. It doesn't necessarily happen. Look at all the teachers out there who are paying out of their own pocket, or paying, for school supplies. I've seen it time and time again. When I was working in retail, I brought up, I don't know how many teachers have been paying for school supplies out of their own pockets. And the fact of the matter is, they were already not being paid very well to begin with. So this cut into extra money that they could have used for their own needs, for their own families. But because they were so dedicated, they spent that money on school supplies for their schools because of the budget cuts. There weren't enough supplies for their students. That's the kind of reality. That's the kind of thing that has driven me away from the hyper-capitalist, austerity-driven, invisible hand, blind faith in markets kind of approach. If I had to describe my political philosophy at this point, I would describe myself as a populist. I would say that I believe that there are many aspects, not all, maybe not 100%, but many aspects of the program of the People's Party in 1892 that could still be realized and would benefit this country in some respects. What we need is a hybrid mixed economy, not a purely socialist economy, not a purely capitalist economy, but a mixture of the two, a hybrid that works best for all. So those industries that work better under private control would remain under private control, maybe move a little bit more to worker control, cooperative ownership or something like that, but they'll remain under private control. And those industries that work best under government supervision, as it were, would be transferred to public ownership. An example of that would be utilities, because this is a basic service that services everyone. It's already a monopoly. It's simply a matter of transferring the control of that monopoly from a private company which is driven by profits and therefore wants to gouge and squeeze the customers as much as they can through fees and so forth, to ownership by the public at large, and thus putting it under the control of people who are much more interested in serving the community. It should be a non-profit thing. Utilities should not be about profit. Your electric bill should not be driven by profit, for example. It should be much lower. It should be based on the actual realistic cost, as it were. Cost-driven rather than profit-driven. I think if you saw that it was actually driven by the real cost and not by the profits, I think that you would have a situation where people would not be gouged by APS or SRP to the extent that they have been. Now, they do have some low-income programs, which is good, but on balance, as a general rule, the private utility monopolies are bad for this country and bad for our communities. What they need to do is nationalize all utilities, bring them under public ownership, do the same thing with natural gas, oil, with the energy sector, with coal companies and so forth. But those will be geared toward the ultimate liquidation of those industries. As to say, we would move away from using fossil fuels, and we would kind of use that ownership, conservatorship, to transition painlessly away from fossil fuels, or as painlessly as possible, and avoid the destitution, avoid the impoverishment of the workers. Make it easier for them to get to a place where they have a new way of life, new source of income. That brings me to the next proposal, which is UBI. I believe very strongly we need a UBI, Universal Basic Income. So what we would have in this country is a system where everyone would receive a certain amount of money, just like they do in Alaska. It works perfectly fine in Alaska. You would have a certain amount of money sent to every citizen. What this does is, like, for instance, if you lose your job and you're laid off, you have some extra income. Suppose you have a hard time getting a job and unemployment runs out, or unemployment doesn't cover all the bills. This would help. It would help, like, single mothers who maybe need to spend more time with their kids for a little bit, especially if they're younger and can't really afford a nanny or a babysitter all the time, or daycare. Wives or husbands or whatever who want to be homemakers, they want to be in maybe a one-income family and do that for a while, especially with younger children around. People being able to afford homes for the first time, being able to pay their rent in a more timely fashion, things like that. Especially during this pandemic, you can see the need for it. See all the number of people who've been furloughed, myself included. You can see the benefit of a UBI system. But for the short term, stimulus will help as well. But it needs to be long term a UBI. We need to use the stimulus to transition from the stimulus system to a UBI system, Universal Basic Income. And in time, this can be much more beneficial to us all. If you've seen the harmful effects that the welfare reform program has done, especially in the lives of families where mothers have to work outside the home and also try to raise their kids, they have to work sometimes 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, and they have little time to spend with their kids. They can maybe cut out 1 or 2 of those jobs and maybe work just 1 job, or part-time job, or full-time job, but more limited hours, and still have more time with their kids, because they're not desperately trying to keep afloat. Some of these single mothers are working 2 to 3 jobs. They may or may not have child support, and child support is certainly important. But bear in mind, there's a lot of pressure to put on the dad because the needs of the mother are so extreme. In this situation, you have a situation where A, it would be easier for the dad to pay child support. B, the need for child support would be reduced because you would have the UBI. So the mother's financial squeeze would not be so hard on her, and thus consequently would not be so hard on the ex or the father, both because he'd be getting the universal basic income and help manage his own finances, and also because she would not be needing as much child support from him due to having the UBI herself. Because of course child support is one of the situations where there are no easy solutions. The woman is getting squeezed, the man is getting squeezed. It's tough on both of them. He's having a hard time paying the child support. She's having a hard time surviving without it. Things like that. Both of them are having a hard time. It's true with alimony to some extent. Sometimes it's a little bit more abused than child support alimony is, but I understand the need up to a point. Well, if you have a UBI, the need for alimony would be reduced. You have a situation. Also, if you have increased wages, the need for alimony is reduced because you have people making more and thus can afford to live better without having as much contributed by the ex. So, in general, also things like paying the student loans, Personally, I think they should just forgive all student loans. I think is ridiculous. The government has become like the top loan shark in the world, um, especially into this pandemic. It's insane that people are still expected to pay these loans. They that they often borrowed, at least partly from naivety, is to say they trusted their advisors. They were young. They didn't know the full implications. They certainly didn't know how hard it would be to get a job in the market. Sold bill of goods and said, yeah, if you go to college, you're going to have an easy time getting a job and so forth. And then you find out, oh, by the way, the only job that will hire you straight out of college is McDonald's right down the road. Enjoy flipping the burgers. You know, nothing against people who flip burgers. I have utmost respect for people in the food service industry. I've been in that industry. I worked in that industry for a short time. I have utmost respect for that. I'm just saying that is not the future that they signed up for. That is not what they expected when they went to college. So some of it's their majors and so forth, but a lot of it is, I mean, some of those majors may not always be practical and prevalent, or those courses. That's another thing. You could reform the education system by not requiring all of the same courses. But of course, if you do that, certain people lose money, so they want to make people take courses that are not related to their major, that they really don't need to take. You've taken those courses in high school. You've taken the basic education and the basic studies. You don't need, if you're a history major, you don't need to take another algebra course in high school. I mean, in college. You don't need to take a calculus course in college. You know, if you're a mathematician, you don't need to be taking like 2 or 3 social science classes necessary if you don't want to do it. But of course, our system is driven by the realization that they can get paid more because these students are borrowing all this money. So they're assigning classes, courses that frankly aren't really all that necessary. You could be out of college in probably at least a year less. Shave a year or 2 off your college education requirements, not spend as much money, not have to borrow as much money, and so forth. But that's the system we have. People are required to take courses that have nothing to do with their major, and then they are also encouraged to take courses that don't benefit them in real life, and some of them have no practical application. Some of them impart no real knowledge. Others, of course, are beneficial. But if you don't have the actual professor teaching it, you have what, a lecturer, assistant. Most cases, very seldom do you have an actual full professor teaching a real course. So, you know, they hand it off to their assistants who do most of the assignments and so forth. There's a lot of reforms that need to be done. There's a lot of basic structural changes. And I do think that we do need a full-on public transit, mass transit plan, transportation plan that would reduce congestion, reduce the amount of dependence on automobiles, on fossil fuels, and so forth. There's a lot of things we can do. We can ban fracking. We can move away from fossil fuels. Signing the Paris Climate Accord, okay, that's fine. That only gets us so far. The Green New Deal is frankly a joke. I mean, let's be honest here. It doesn't go nearly as far enough in many ways, and it goes too far in others. It's not a practical thing. It's not even a bill. It's a manifesto. What I would prefer is something more like the OFF Act. If you look at the OFF Act, proposed by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, who I supported, by the way, in the Democratic primaries. Full disclosure, I've been a strong Tulsi supporter for a while. It's a much better plan. Get us much more off the fossil fuels, as the name implies, moving us away from that. Another great step in the right direction, and it could be, I think, subsidized if we get subsidies from other things like oil and gas, which we don't need to be subsidized. would be this plan proposed by Jane Goodall and some others to plant 1 trillion trees worldwide. Now, what this would do, of course, trees contribute oxygen. Humans and other animals contribute carbon dioxide. So if you get the number of trees reduced, of course, you're going to have a harder time countering the carbon dioxide with oxygen. If you have 1 trillion trees planted worldwide, you have much more oxygen being produced and released into the atmosphere, which would have a countering or neutralizing effect, a decarbonization kind of effect, in terms of carbon fuels and so forth, the carbon gases in the atmosphere that are heating up our planet. Climate change is caused primarily by an increase in carbon dioxide, which is melting the glaciers and so forth. And of course, let's not ignore the elephant in the room. The increased or renewed nuclear arms race. This is not a joke. We have to be very worried about this. We have to be very concerned because this is a very real problem. If we are not careful as a country, as a world, we will be headed into a new nuclear arms race full scale. We are already moving in that direction. If Trump, as expected, does not renew this last arms treaty with Russia, which appears he's not going to do, what will happen is we will have an unregulated nuclear arsenal in every country of the world. Unregulated nuclear arsenal. What that means is, of course, there will be no sanctions, no punishments, no limitations on the increased use, testing, and proliferation of nuclear weapons. Now, whatever his faults under his administration, at least Bill Clinton was trying to stop that. Every president since has largely kind of ignored that in many ways. It's been put on the back burner. But at least Clinton, for all his faults, at least tried to prevent nuclear proliferation. He tried to limit weapons of mass destruction, push for the Chemical Weapons Convention, and so forth. Unfortunately, what we've seen a new Cold War. We've seen worsening relations with Russia and China. You got Trump rattling the saber at China. We got the Democrats rattling the saber at Russia. And it's all moving in the direction of possibly pushing Russia and China closer together in opposition to the United States. That has already started to happen to a certain extent. If we're facing a Russian-Chinese alliance, that is very damaging to our national security. It is a very real threat to our national security. We need to make sure we do not push Russia and China closer together. Because if you do that, you have two very powerful enemies and an incentive to increase our nuclear arsenals even further. And they're already at levels that could kill off the world and its population, 20,000 times over? I don't even have the stats for that, but it's insane levels of overkill. So we need to be careful about this risk of heightened tensions with especially with nuclear armed nations. And we need to get back into that Iran nuclear deal that was actually stopping Iran's nuclear program. We'd actually gotten things under control where Iran was not developing the nuclear weapons, at least not as fast as it would have without it. So it's another example of the sort of insanity that we need to curtail. You don't hear these kind of topics being discussed by Mark Kelly or Mark McSally. You don't hear this kind of serious discussion, serious consideration of facts and reality. What they discuss is a few policy points, but it's mostly trading off accusations against each other. Well, Mark Kelly did this, or Martha McSally did that. Okay, her voting record is fair game. If he's got any conflict of interest, that's fair game as well. But as a general rule, the focus has been too much on attacking each other and not nearly enough on what their policy proposals will be. What's Mark Kelly's foreign policy? We already know Martha McSally's foreign policy. It's clear from her Senate record. But what's Mark McKelly's foreign policy? I see nothing in his tweets or anything to indicate a clear, consistent vision in foreign policy. And that's a big problem if you're a senator, because you're going to be asked to vote on treaties. You're going to be asked to vote on ambassadors. So things of that nature. Get votes like the Yemen vote, where you had, to his credit, Bernie Sanders corralling votes, even Republican votes. He whipped those for a vote to get us out of helping the Saudis in their stupid genocidal war in Yemen. So this is not the kind of thing being discussed. We're not having serious discussion of stimulus. It's not pushing forward nearly fast enough, and it's probably not going to be nearly the right kind of stimulus, even if we do get a few table scraps from it, like we did with the CARES Act. Let's be frank here. None of the proposals so far that I've seen, other than the UBI, is anything kind of like a visionary proposal. And yet, even the most modest proposals of stimulus have made a dramatic improvement while they lasted. And their sudden absence when the CARES Act expired was also felt. Because you had people who were actually having, and some people complained about this, but actually having a livable standard, a more than a subsistence wage, but a living wage for once in their lives. And some people were mad about that because they were afraid that they wouldn't want to work their job. Well, I can tell you this. Nobody wants to be unemployed. We'd like to have jobs, because there's like one job for every 4 people. And these people, many of us were living better. Yeah, and that's not it. That's not an indictment of the higher unemployment. It's an indictment of our wages. It's an indictment of what's done to workers. They need to pay workers better, not try to limit how much unemployment a person's getting. So it just means that the standard of living was subpar, which we already knew that. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. Just bear in mind, ask yourself this. Does Mark Kelly have a plan to get us out of this mess? Does Martha McSally have a plan to get us out of this mess? Does Joe Biden? Does Donald Trump? Do any of them? Do they have any concrete ideas of how to control utility prices, utility hikes, for example? I'd be interested to see what Bill Mundell plans to do. I'm curious about him, the Corporation Commission. But I at least have some optimism with him, because I think he seems a little bit more consumer friendly. But in any case, as you can see, I am a people's candidate, a populist candidate, an independent populist running for U.S. Senate from Arizona in this special election. I don't expect to win. The late entry protest candidacy. But I'm going to be back. I'm going to be back, and I'm going to be running for the regular term in 2022 in the midterms. So anyway, there we are.